It was a quiet morning at the local shooting range when she walked in, just a simple woman, no one special, with no extraordinary history. People barely glanced her way, but the looks were enough. They saw her as out of place, a novice with no business holding a gun. Laughter echoed in the air as she set up, trying to figure out the basics of stance and aim, clearly struggling. The regulars couldn't help but sneer, whispering amongst themselves about how she wouldn't even hit the target. But then something unexpected happened. As she lined up her first shot, the mockery faded into silence. She squeezed the trigger and hit the target dead center. The crowd was stunned. She was no longer just a woman in the background. She was focused, determined, and as she lined up her next shots, the air seemed to crackle with tension. One shot after another, she carved her name into the wall of the range, leaving behind a trail of perfect marks that defied everyone's expectations. But it wasn't just about proving them wrong. There was something deeper behind her calm composure, something no one saw coming. What drove her to that moment? Why did she keep going, even when everyone counted her out? The truth, it was just beginning to unfold. As the shots echoed through the range, the once doubtful crowd began to grow curious. But no one could understand what had sparked this transformation. The woman didn't flinch, didn't even show the slightest sign of nervousness. It was as if she was in her own world, her every movement deliberate, calculated. The mocking whispers had stopped, replaced by the subtle shift of people edging closer, trying to figure out what was happening. To them, she was just another face in a crowd, another person who'd wandered into the range with no real skill. But in her mind, the story was far from ordinary. She had been coming here for weeks, quietly practicing, not to impress anyone, but for a purpose that no one could grasp. Every time the gun felt heavy in her hands, she reminded herself of what she was training for. It wasn't just the target she was aiming at, it was the memories, the weight of her past, and the unspoken challenges she had been carrying all her life. No one knew that under her calm exterior, she had faced more than most could ever imagine. The target wasn't just paper. It was the ghosts of all the times she'd been told she couldn't, the failures she'd endured, and the silent battles no one saw. But what she was aiming for now was far more important than anyone could have guessed. As the final shot rang out, the entire room fell into an eerie silence. The target now resembled a piece of art, each hole perfectly lined up, each shot an almost impossible feat of precision. But the woman didn't pause to look at her work. She was focused, her eyes sharp, scanning the room. The shift in the atmosphere hadn't gone unnoticed by her. The crowd had gone from skeptical to curious, but there was something more beneath their stares now, something she couldn't quite place. Was it admiration, fear, or was it something darker, like resentment? For a moment, she could hear the whispers again, but this time they weren't mocking. They were questioning. Who was she really? Why was she here? What was she running from? And why, despite her calm composure, did she seem like she was carrying a weight much heavier than anyone could understand? It wasn't just about the shots, about the simple act of firing a gun. This was bigger than that. The woman, whose name no one even knew, wasn't just proving herself on the shooting range. She was pushing back against something much more personal. Her life had been filled with challenges, each one tougher than the last. She'd spent years in the shadows, never speaking out, always playing it safe. But today, something had shifted. The tension she carried for so long, whether from a past she couldn't escape or a future she wasn't sure she deserved, had built up to this one moment. As the crowd finally began to disperse, still whispering and casting uncertain glances in her direction, the woman didn't leave. She stood there, looking at the wall, her fingers slowly gripping the cold, metal gun once more. Something wasn't finished yet. She had one more thing to prove. But what was it? And to whom? The answers would only come when she took her next shot. As she stood there, the weight of the gun in her hand felt like the weight of the world. Her fingers were steady, but inside, her heart raced. There was something about today, something about this moment that felt like it was leading up to a breaking point. The others in the range were starting to gather around her again, but they weren't just watching her. They were sizing her up, wondering what she would do next. The air grew thicker, heavier with every passing second. The woman could feel their eyes, but she didn't let it shake her. She'd been through worse. They didn't know her story. They couldn't know it. And yet, with each shot she had taken, she had begun to carve out a new identity. But it wasn't just about skill anymore. It was about control. Control over a life that had often felt out of her hands. Control over a future she feared she might never get to experience. The silence around her was deafening now. The other shooters, who had once snickered, were now unusually quiet, watching her closely, as if waiting for something big to happen. But they didn't know what was coming. And neither did she. She only knew one thing. This next shot was going to be different. There was a man in the back of the range, one who had been watching her from the start. He was a regular, a sharpshooter in his own right, and his gaze had been anything but kind. She could feel the judgment in his eyes, the quiet challenge he had been throwing her way since the moment she walked in. And now she could sense that he was waiting for her to fail, waiting for her to make a mistake. Her breath hitched, but she steadied herself. This wasn't just about beating them anymore. This wasn't even about proving herself. This was personal. Her finger hovered over the trigger, the world around her fading into a blur. She could feel the pressure building up, an almost suffocating tension. She wasn't just shooting at a target. She was shooting at the past, at the people who had underestimated her, at the darkness that had followed her for so long. The range was still, frozen in anticipation. And then, with one final breath, she pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot echoed, but it wasn't just the gun that made an impact. The shot rang out, but something was wrong. The moment the gunfire echoed through the range, the silence that followed wasn't just the usual stillness. It was heavier, charged with a kind of tension that set the hairs on the back of her neck on edge. She had expected the usual reaction, whispers, maybe even some applause. But this time, there was only a strange pause, followed by a sudden, unsettling noise from the back of the range. Her eyes darted toward the sound, her pulse quickening. The man, the sharpshooter who had been eyeing her from the start, was no longer standing in the background. He was walking toward her. His steps were slow, deliberate, but his face had shifted from skepticism to something far darker, something she couldn't quite read. He wasn't smiling, and his eyes held a kind of intensity she hadn't seen before. Something in his posture told her that this wasn't just another challenge, it was a warning. As he closed the distance, his gaze never left hers. The others, the regulars who had been so eager to judge her before, had suddenly gone quiet. No one dared to speak as the sharpshooter reached her, his presence now filling the entire space. Without a word, he nodded toward the target. She followed his gesture, only to notice something she hadn't expected, a crack in the wall. The shot she had taken had hit the center of the target, but it hadn't just gone through it. It had caused a massive dent in the wall itself, a deep, jagged mark that was now spreading wider like a crack in glass. Her heart raced. This wasn't just an ordinary range wall. This was reinforced, built to withstand the force of any bullet. So how had her shot done this? She didn't understand. The sharpshooter's voice cut through the thick silence. "You're not the first one to try, you know." Her breath caught in her throat. What did he mean by that? The air around them seemed to freeze as she tried to process the meaning of his words. The mystery was deepening, and suddenly, the stakes felt much higher than she had ever imagined. The sharpshooter's words hung in the air, thick with a weight she couldn't shake. "You're not the first one to try, you know." She stared at him, confusion clouding her mind. What was he talking about? And why did the target now feel so much more dangerous than it ever had before? He noticed her hesitation and stepped closer, his eyes hardening. This wall, these targets, they're not just here for practice. They're part of something bigger. Something dangerous. He paused, letting the words settle between them. "You thought you were just here to shoot, but you've opened something that wasn't meant to be opened." Her heart skipped a beat. His voice was calm, but there was a deep tension in his every movement. She glanced at the target, then at the wall, where the crack she had made continued to widen. The crack wasn't just physical. It was like something had been set in motion, something she hadn't meant to stir. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room, watching in stunned silence, as if waiting for some revelation.